Hello and welcome to the fourth video in this series on the phenomenal externalist theory of consciousness called Portalism. Throughout the first three videos in this series, I've claimed that consciousness is not the brain. So if this statement is true, we must then ask if the brain is necessary to Portalism, and if so, what role does it play? The theory of Portalism holds that all biological systems across the zone of life are conscious to some degree, but many of those systems do not even have brains. Systems such as plants, protozoa, sponges. One of the strengths of Portalism is that it holds the locus of consciousness to be in the world and not in the brain. Thus the theory overcomes the limitations of neural chauvinism and multiple realizability, which can present significant problems for many materialist theories, but as according to Portalism, the means to consciousness for any living organism is not dependent on its having a brain at all, but on its having a portal mechanism through which it accesses the all-encompassing horizon of consciousness, the fundamental force of nature that resides in the world. But as this video addresses the role of brain function in Portalism, I will confine the scope of the presentation to the animal kingdom. Also, as current research indicates that the biological and/or biochemical portal mechanism is likely to be located within the constructs of the brain, at least in the higher animals. When I refer to the term brain, I am including the entire central nervous system. So, are brains necessary? Many, if not most, of the members of the animal kingdom possess brains in some form or another. We are mostly familiar with cats and dogs and other mammals, but brains also extend to insects and arachnids. And even earthworms have a bilobed brain ganglion with 302 neurons. But even in the light of neurological evidence, it would be a mistake to claim that all portal mechanisms are biological and biochemical constructs within brains, as although most animals have brains, some do not. For example, jellyfish and sponges are animals without brains. Sponges have no nervous system at all, while jellyfish have a rudimentary ring of neurons which govern their ability to swim. Like plants, most sponges are sessile. They are built to pump water and do very little else, but they can develop toxins that discourage predators, which is a form of problem solving, and problem solving presupposes intelligence. Intelligence presupposes consciousness, as I shall argue in the next video in the series. The point here being that although a brain may be necessary to, but not sufficient for, consciousness, it remains absolutely essential for many reasons, the most important one being that it keeps the body alive, the body being the means by which we, as mind, move through the physical world, and thus are able to navigate our reality. When the body dies, the brain dies, and when the brain dies, the portal closes. The localization of individual consciousness is dissolved, with the result that the mind vanishes. So we shall see that in Portalism, at least in the higher animals, the locus of the mind is external to, yet existentially dependent upon, the brain. The homeostatic responsibilities of the brain are essential, as they keep the body alive and the portal intact. These include temperature regulation, body fluid composition, blood sugar levels, gas concentration, blood pressure, and many more. As mind exists external to the brain, it can have an effect upon the conditions of the body via downward causality. For example, when the mind encounters a scorpion in the world, that might raise the blood pressure and the heart rate if indeed the person is frightened by scorpions. Yet mind cannot directly interfere with the brain's causal regulatory response to that particular physical stimulus. Although the brain has no determinative power over mind, its determinative power over the body is absolute, and in an existential crisis, its actions will ultimately take precedence over mind. For example, if I am mountain climbing at high altitudes and my extremities begin to freeze, the brain will shut off blood flow to my hands and feet, redirecting it in the interests of self-preservation to itself and the major organs. As mind, I may will the brain not to do this, but it does no good. The brain's priority for self-preservation overrides the will in all cases. Even when I eventually fall unconscious and collapse into the snow, the brain will continue to execute its responsibilities until it finally freezes to death. The mind has no direct influence over the homeostatic responses of the brain, although willing oneself to breathe slowly and deeply can affect blood oxygen and heart rate, which might be the causes of the homeostatic regulation that the brain is in fact responding to. These regulatory responses have evolved through time, the brain relentlessly monitoring the body and continually making adjustments, regardless of whether or not the mind is even operational. In extreme cases involving great pain or trauma, the brain can shut the portal down completely, incurring unconsciousness, while still continuing on with its homeostatic mission until injury overwhelms it or it runs out of fuel. Brains do not think. Consciousness is not the brain, and nothing unconscious can think. Brains process input data from the senses and through the portal disclose it to mind, which is in the world. Aside from regulating the body, the brain is responsible for the operation and maintenance of the senses. Whether these are the human modalities of sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste, the radar of Nagel's bat, or the forked tongue of the lizard and snake, the brain maintains these sense organs, but is incapable of formulating any understanding of that which is sensed. The assignment of meaning and context to sensory input occurs only in consciousness, only in mind. For example, the ears detect sounds. The operational mechanics of the tympanic membrane, the stapes, and the cochlear nerve send impulses to the brain, but the cognition of language, the decoding and interpretation of sounds, occurs in mind. The brain can't do it. The brain only receives the auditory impulses. It has no ability to assign meaning to them. The recognition of certain sounds as speech, and its interpretation according to syntactic and semantic rules stored in procedural memory, and the subsequent understanding of the sounds as words and the formulation of any response as per that understanding occurs entirely in mind. Imagine that you are playing baseball and are up to bat. You observe the incoming ball and must decide to swing or not to swing. The split second you consciously decide to swing, the brain orders the release of the acetylcholine necessary to contract the muscles that enable you to swing the bat at the ball. The mind does not consciously initiate and regulate the process of acetylcholine release or any of the other internal processes incessantly occurring as per the regulatory mission of the brain. By the same token, the brain has no idea when to swing the bat, neither is it cognizant of why the bat needs to be swung at all, because it cannot think. The brain also stores, catalogs, orders, and links memories, retrieving and disclosing them to mind for experiencing, either on demand or as a response to a stimulus in the world. The neurons that fire the first time the immediate memory is created and stored are the same neurons that fire when it is immediately retrieved, but the subjective experience of a memory and the cognition of its context and meaning occurs in the mind, not in the brain. So what is the relationship between the brain and the portal mechanism? Having a functional portal autogenically manifests mind. There are no other preconditions. The locus of mind is external to the body, therefore it is in the world. Through its being in, mind discloses the world to the sensory modalities of the brain, through which objects and states of affairs within the world are made encounterable to mind. If we accept the plausibility of the brain being the locus of the portal into consciousness, we are then in a position to examine the effects upon the mind that may be caused by events impacting the brain. If the mind is the brain, as mind-brain identity theory holds, then that which impacts the brain must also impact the mind, as eliminative materialists believe. But this is not necessarily the case with externalist theories. As Portalism holds, consciousness is a fundamental force of nature and as such cannot be damaged or enhanced. In its irreducible ontological state, it simply is. Individualized localizations of consciousness inherit this same ontology. However, as minds, they have two important differences. They have content by virtue of their being in the world, and as localizations of the horizon of consciousness, they become existentially dependent upon the portal mechanism. So situated, The mind cannot be directly impacted, but the portal can, and in fact often is. The effect of these impacts being manifested not in the nature of consciousness, but in the content of consciousness. The all-encompassing horizon of consciousness, as the irreducible ontological ground, is constant and immutable, wherein the content of mind can be altered correlative to the condition of the portal. One of the most dramatic examples of the relationship of the portal to the brain involves the effects of hallucinogenic drugs. Research being conducted at several facilities in the United States and the UK have shown how these drugs, specifically LSD and psilocybin, can expand the intellectual limitations that the brain naturally places upon itself, allowing one to experience an enhanced state of one's own reality. There exist regions within the human brain that make up the default mode network, which is a collection of hub centers that work together to control and repress consciousness. Research has shown how LSD decreases communication between these brain regions, seeming to offer evidence toward the claim that it is possible to expand these natural boundary limitations for intellectual capacity and, by extension, affect the content of mind. But is this evidence that the mind is the brain? Portalism holds that an increase in intellectual capacity caused by the drugs is indeed the reality, but that the drugs are not acting upon consciousness. Rather, they act upon the portal by enhancing its connection into consciousness. These drugs expand the natural barriers that the brain places on intellect, so as to make sure that sensory data within the field of perception does not overwhelm its ability to process it, effectively widening the portal and increasing the mind's potential for phenomenal experience. Hallucinogenic drugs do not affect consciousness itself, they affect the portal, with the result being an expanded localization of consciousness, an expanded mind. In 1995, Alan Watts observed that the self is essentially composed of ego, memory, and intellect. Using this definition, the brain's homeostatic needs could be considered as ego, manifested as the I want this, I don't want that. The brain manages the ego and memory and houses the capacity for intellectual potential, but it is only within mind that the intellect has the capability to achieve agency. Although the components necessary for intellectual potential reside within the brain, their actualization can only occur in mind. Although brain does not require the mind in order to function, it does require fuel in the form of food and water, which it cannot obtain without the mind because it cannot think. When, due to trauma or disease, the portal is disabled to the degree that consciousness is suspended, the brain continues to run merrily on doing its job and does so until it runs out of fuel, because without consciousness, the brain has no way to signal its needs to the world. Finding food and water is an operation that requires world, and the mind is the only interface to the world that the brain has. Even though bodies are things in the world, all living organisms will eventually die from lack of life-sustaining fuel because without consciousness, be it human or paramecium, they have no ability to comprehend and navigate the world. Recently, physicalism has enjoyed a resurgence within the analytic philosophical community due to the activities of a relative newcomer to the movement, the Neuro Philosopher. These are men and women with strong backgrounds in philosophy and neuroscience, many of them quite gifted thinkers. They dwell in the fantastic world of neuroimagery, searching for the correlates of consciousness, using cutting-edge image technologies like positron emission tomography, electroencephalography, and functional magnetic resonance imaging. It is valuable, exciting work, and the images of brain activity can be intriguing, but that's all that they are. Intriguing images of brain activity. They are not pictures of, neither are they proof of, cognitive processes of the brain in action. Brain waves are not thoughts, and although the images of brain activity may be correlative to a thought, they do not cause the thought, neither are they the thought. Correlation is not causality. The problem surfaces when neuroscientists either confuse or conflate the thought itself and its neural basis as the same thing, as they must be if mind-brain identity theory is true. As compelling as brain imagery can be, there remains no proof that they correlate to cognition. The problem is that the majority of neuroscientists operate from the presupposition that consciousness is the brain, tending to overstate their results and overdraw their conclusions in an effort to conform them within a theory whose primary assumption is in error. The simplest argument is that the brain is not the mind, that mind does in fact exist and that its locus is in the world. Dissect the brain and its neural networks down to the atomic level and you will never find a thought, an idea, or a belief. Thinking, reasoning, aesthetics, language processing, subjective experience, and reflexive awareness are all functions of mind. Consciousness cannot arise or derive from non-conscious matter, which is precisely what the brain is. The brain and mind are existentially codependent upon each other in terms of sustaining the life of the complete organism, and each has its essential and necessary role to play. Thank you for watching this video on the role of the brain in Portalism. Make sure to watch the next video in the series where I argue how all biological systems across the zone of life, and including the plant kingdom, are conscious, at least to some degree, a position that makes Portalism unique and that no other theory can make this claim. In it, I will describe my reasoning for not only how all biological systems are conscious, but how, as per Portalism, they cannot not be conscious. Hope to see you then.